Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm Helen Alder, Head of Knowledge for SIPS. Welcome to the 6th edition of the UK Salary Survey event. This year, we are doing a webinar rather than a face-to-face event, allowing many more of you to join. In fact, we've had over 700 registrations, which is a record-breaking number for SIPS. We've also received over 5,000 responses globally to the survey, another record for the salary survey. The official launch date is the 30th of June, but all attendees will be sent a preview copy of the report directly after the event from Hayes. So, moving on to the salary survey agenda for today. So firstly, we have Malcolm Harrison, the SIPS CEO, talking about some of the opportunities and challenges for the procurement professionals today. Then we'll move on to John Glenn, who's the SIPS economist and a visiting fellow who's going to do a talk on the economy and the effects on procurement. Then we'll move lastly on to Scott Dance, who's going to talk about some of the new ways of working and some key insights from the salary survey. We'll then move on to a Q&A. Please submit any questions you have into the Q&A function on the screen that you can see on the toolbar at the bottom. If you would like to direct your question to anybody in particular, please put "for the attention of" and name the person you want to direct the question to. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Malcolm to start his presentation.
Helen, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome everybody. It's great to have this opportunity to talk to you in what are clearly very unusual, indeed unprecedented times. When I thought earlier on in the year about what I would be saying to you today, I was going to be talking all about the fact that absolutely it's a new decade, there are lots of opportunities out there are lots of challenges, and I think that the challenges that the profession is facing based on the changing context, the focus on sustainability, the importance of ensuring that we're getting real transparency into our supply chains, that we're embracing digitization. We're embracing the new technologies which allow us to be able to manage supply chains more effectively, more efficiently, with better information, which allows us to take better decisions. And then, of course, along came COVID-19, and the whole world has literally turned upside down. So that new context now is very different. It's very real. It's very much affecting all of us in our daily lives, and it's affecting all of the organizations that we work for, and to very, very differing degrees. And I have talked to many people over the last few weeks, and it is clear that once everybody had got round the challenges of working remotely, working from home, then depending on which sector you're working in, the impact of coronavirus, of COVID-19 on your organization and your business and your sector has been really very different. Some sectors have literally seen their demand disappear. If you work in hospitality, in catering, hotels, restaurants, pubs, cafes, clearly from the moment that the government locked down the country, there has been no demand, and I mean almost no demand for your businesses. If you're working in food retail, however, it's changed the other way, because more people are now working from home, more people are therefore eating at home, and therefore more people are buying more from supermarkets. And if you work in between that in terms of food supply, well, yeah, it's changed, not to zero, but it's changed dramatically, because of course you've had a real big shift in mix. So the context has changed for all of us. And what I wanted to do today was just talk a little bit about how we as the professional body see that impacting upon the profession. It's very clear that with the impact of COVID-19, we need to make sure that our supply chains are not just focused on achieving best value, but are truly resilient. And COVID-19, the pandemic, is not the only factor out here. If we think about what we're already seeing in terms of trade barriers, in terms of tariff barriers, the continued imposition of tariffs between China and the USA. If we think of Brexit and the impact that will have on the UK, and what barriers there may or may not be as and when we leave the EU leave the EU at the end of the transition period at the end of 2020. These are all going to impact significantly on supply chains, and ensuring that our supply chains are truly agile and are resilient and able to cope with these different barriers, able to cope with the different geopolitical issues that we're seeing, is a fundamental challenge for professionals in procurement and supply. And then we have the challenge of technology. And not to me so much a challenge, but really an opportunity, because technology is absolutely going to power supply chains. It's technology that's going to help procurement and supply professionals to be able to operate in a more effective and more efficient way. And then it would be remiss of me not also to mention some of the sustainability and environmental challenges. And I just highlighted here single-use plastics, and indeed the backdrop of this slide just shows the sheer challenge and the scale of the challenge that the world is facing in terms of misuse of single-use plastics. And again, let's be really careful, because single-use plastics, like the ones we see on this slide, are absolutely the ones that we want to eradicate, that we don't want to see damaging the environment, damaging the world in which we operate. At the same time, single-use plastics, when those single-use plastics are used to help save people's lives, either through producing drug delivery systems or indeed through producing PPE, which is fundamentally important and critical to all of us these days, those are not bad single-use plastics. I guess it's a little bit like cholesterol. It's bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. And whereas you want to have good cholesterol, it's the bad cholesterol you want to eradicate, and that's the same issue with single-use plastics. We want to make sure that the world is focusing in the right, responsible way on reducing single-use plastics. So supply chains have been turned upside down by coronavirus and the impact that it's had. And those organizations that found themselves reliant upon single or large suppliers, those organizations that had focused on manufacturing with supply chains which were lean but potentially very long, or indeed the focus on how did we make sure there was no working capital, no stock in our supply chains, a real focus on it must be lowest cost. And all of that, I think, has been exposed in terms of then a lack of resilience to be able to cope with some of the changes in demand that our supply chains have all been facing. Could we ever have forecast the scale of some of these demand changes? No, we could not. However, having supply chains which are resilient and supply chains which are able to deal with peaks and troughs in demand is absolutely something that good supply chain and procurement professionals should be putting in place. And that also requires very often us to make sure we're developing the right suppliers. And the right suppliers, maybe these are nearshore suppliers, maybe these are suppliers that can bring a particular solution to our supply chains. And maybe this sometimes requires companies to invest in suppliers. And I've been really encouraged over the last few weeks and months to see some organizations taking steps to make sure that they protect their supply chains, they invest in their suppliers, and even taking the steps to make sure they're paying their suppliers more promptly than they normally would do, to make sure that those suppliers who are critical to their supply chains can stay afloat. So indeed, supply chain disruption is having a big impact on all of us. And how do I think I see this changing as we sort of move into a world where we've had a pandemic, and a world where people are saying, yes, you might well see additional pandemics, and therefore we need to be prepared. It's been really encouraging to see how much collaboration there has been between sometimes naturally competing organizations to solve some of the sector problems. And yes, a lot of that has been directly related to coronavirus. So the work that's gone on between competitors to find ways of building ventilators. Companies that never normally built ventilators have worked together and worked with designs from companies whose specialism is building ventilators to share those designs in a collaborative way towards solve those sector issues. At the same time, we've seen many organizations appreciate the importance of having real transparency down their supply chains. So it might not just be your prime supplier that's causing that disruption to your supply chain. It might be your supplier's supplier, or your supplier's supplier's supplier, or indeed your supplier's 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 supplier. So having that transparency down in supply chains, I think, is going to be really important in the future. And that's where technology undoubtedly comes in. As procurement and supply professionals are thinking about how do they move forward, then, and how do they build these resilient supply chains, I do believe it's so important that people think about the organization, and they think about the challenges that the organization is facing, and how is the organization going to come up with the right resilience. And then, yes, we need to make sure that the supply chain fits that resilience. But I do believe this is a real opportunity for the profession to yet again make sure that we're being properly heard at the top table in terms of us talking business first and function second. And then, perhaps importantly to today's discussion, which is going to be all about people and capabilities, yeah, we do need to make sure that we have the right data and the right capabilities. And the right data driven by having the right systems that can provide us with accurate data, and then indeed the right capabilities, and that's down to all of us to make sure that we are investing in and developing people with the right talent for the future. So with that new context and the impact of coronavirus, I felt it was really important that we didn't also ignore some of the really important things that are going on, which impact so hugely on our profession. And there's just 3 or 4 that I want to cover here today. The first one to me is all about digital transformation. And we've talked a lot about this in recent years. We have started to see now some really good concrete examples of how organizations are really benefiting from that investment in technology and the transparency and also the control that that technology brings. And I just wanted to highlight here some of the work that we've seen Vodafone do, where they've put their focus on technology, not into blockchain or not into just advanced analytics, but really into making sure that the basics are done really, really well. And they have focused on putting in place a really, really strong system to manage POs, to make sure they have the right data, that they have the right control. They've catalogued 22,000 components and focused on those components to make sure that they're understanding the true cost linked to the design of those components. They've also, whilst cataloguing these components, looked at CO2 emissions. So that increased visibility that comes from that better catalogue and those better systems allows them to have that better data, that one version of the truth, which allows them to be more efficient and also to embrace some of the challenges around sustainability. And talking of sustainability, there's a really interesting organization called which is 19 food giants who have got together under the banner of One Planet Business for Diversity. And I could have highlighted any of the organizations shown on this slide. I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the, I think, the really exciting stuff that L'Oreal have been doing. And let's be clear, sustainability is absolutely an issue. Climate change this year, fires in Australia, droughts in Zimbabwe and Zambia, the massive floods in the UK earlier in the year, which we've now probably all forgotten about, should leave us under no illusions whatsoever about the challenges that sustainability presents and the importance of ensuring our supply chains are sustainable. So what L'Oreal have done, a number of examples here, they've really focused on how do they have the right traceability for vanilla coming from suppliers in Madagascar. In Mexico, they wanted to make sure that their supply chains were truly resilient for candela wax. And then Burkina Faso, which is a major source of shea butter. Shea butter is a key component in manufacturing skin cosmetics. And L'Oreal have done is work with 30,000 shea nut gatherers in Burkina Faso to make sure they had the best practice in place in terms of collection and processing. But what they've also done is made sure they can help those suppliers, those individual gatherers to have a better life by investing in cooking stoves. And cooking stoves which have made it more practical for these people to be able to work, to live, to be able to gather their shea nuts. They've also reduced CO2 consumption by 9,000 tons. and they've reduced wood consumption, which would have been burnt on fires, by 4,500 tonnes as well. So some really good concrete examples here of how organisations are embracing sustainability. And within SIPS, we've been working very hard with the construction industry. Many of you will know that we've been involved in the Grenfell Tower inquiry, that horrendous event of June 2017 in London. And what that's led to is us working with the industry, with other professional bodies, to come up with a series of procurement competencies which need to be applied in construction, and making sure that the procurement leads are properly accredited against those competencies, and that those competencies will in the future be applied in all stages in the construction process. Raising standards in procurement, raising standards of construction continues to be a real focus for us at SIPS. So I guess in summary, as I look at this new context and this new world that we're operating in today, supply chain resilience has never been more important. And getting the right transparency, getting the right visibility, having the right systems to allow you to do that are unbelievably important. Collaboration, the collaboration we have seen in recent months, I think has been fantastic. And I really do hope that as we move into a post-pandemic environment, we will see that continued focus on what I would call non-competitive collaboration. And let's not then forget at the same time how important sustainability is to all of us, how important it is that we're protecting our planet, that we're using scarce resources in a professional and responsible way. And for those of us at SIPS, how can we support this agenda? Look, it's very much about ensuring that the people in the profession have the right skills, have the right competencies. For me, it's always been all about people. And our role is to make sure that we can help support that, we can help support people development, we can help raise the voice of the profession, and continue to raise those standards in procurement and supply. So for me, there's never been a more exciting time for the profession. There truly are today really great careers and really great opportunities. We're seeing lots of changes. We're seeing lots of talk about supply chains. And I go back to something I said perhaps a year or so ago. When it gets to the stage when people are thinking about who they work for, or thinking about whose products they buy, or thinking about which company they invest in, which is in part based on the approach that that organization is taking towards risk mitigation, and those issues which you're mitigating the risk of are really important topics for society, then no doubt in my mind, procurement and supply is absolutely a boardroom topic. And that for me allows the opportunity for really, really great people, really capable people to make a huge difference. And I'm convinced we're going to see much more of that in the years to come. Thank you very much. Let me now hand over to Dr. John Glenn, the SIPS economist and a visiting fellow from Cranfield University, who's going to talk to us all about COVID-19 and the impact that he sees that having on our economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. What I'd like to do today is to provide you with an economic overview of what's going to happen as we go through the pandemic, and perhaps more importantly, what are going to be the drivers of the recovery from the pandemic, and what are the factors that we need to be looking out for as we try to plan our way both through and beyond the crisis that we currently find ourselves in. The figures that I'm presenting here are figures that were very well trailed in the press over the last week in the United Kingdom. They come from the Bank of England's monetary policy report, which was published on the 8th of May of this year. And basically what the Bank of England have done, firstly, has said that these are not forecasts. What these are a scenario, what they call their central scenario for the UK economy, based upon a number of assumptions that they've made. And I'm going to talk a lot about those assumptions because they're key to our understanding of how the economy is going to evolve in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months. So we all know that we're in the middle of a very deep recession. And in the first half of this year, it is expected that GDP, or output in the UK economy, will fall by about 30%. For the calendar year of 2020, so that is January 2020 to December 2020, the expectation is that GDP will go down by 15%. So there is some expectation of a slight recovery into the end of this year. And then there is an expectation of quite a significant recovery into 2021, an increase in 15% of GDP. But we have to remember that that increase in 15% is from the trough that we would be in at the end of this year. And then they see a normalization of GDP at around 3% into 2022. The expectation is that unemployment at the end of this year will be pushing 10%. And they make the prediction that if their central scenario were to be fulfilled, that we would revive the level of activity in our economy in the first quarter of 2023 that we enjoyed at the end of 2019. So basically it would take us around 3 years to recover from the recession that we're currently in. But as I said, central to that scenario is a series of assumptions that the Bank of England has made. First of all, and not on my slides, is there is an assumption that there will be no second wave. So if there were a second wave of the pandemic, that would cause those central assumptions to be impacted significantly in a negative way. And therefore the test, track, trace and quarantine that we've all been talking about over the last week and that the government is trying to put in place as quickly as possible is massively important, both for the health of our population and also for the health of our economy. One of the central assumptions, though, is what is this pandemic going to do to consumer and business confidence? They made some pretty clear assumptions that consumer and business confidence would be significantly hit this year. The gentleman on the right is John Maynard Keynes, the famous Cambridge economist. And in the depression of the 1930s, Keynes introduced this notion of the paradox of thrift. He said that in recessions, in depressions, what we tend to do is save more and spend less. And by saving more, what we actually do is contribute to the economy not recovering. So it's massively important that consumers become confident, they stop saving and they start spending. The same is also true of businesses. Businesses worried about their cash flows, worried about the continuance of their organization, tend to rush to cash and they stop investing. And as they stop investing, that means that there is less activity in the economy. So key now as we come out of the depth of the pandemic and into the end of this year is what happens to consumer and business confidence. What we need to see is that consumer and business confidence returning, and then into 2021, businesses to start reinvesting, admittedly from very low levels, and consumers to start going back out into the shops and start buying. So we need to keep a real close eye on consumer and business confidence, and obviously the SIPS market PMI indicators are key indicators of confidence in many sectors of our economy. The government has contributed to this via what I've called its demand stabilization policies. So this is allowing organizations to furlough employees and therefore maintaining employment and also household income. And then the loans and grants that governments have provided to businesses, they're attempting to provide injections of cash into those businesses to make sure that even when their revenues, or those businesses where revenues have collapsed substantially, that they can see themselves through the crisis and be alive, as it were, at a point when the economy recovers. Again, there's going to be a crunch point towards the end of the summer or into autumn where the government has to withdraw some of this support, and we hope that the economy has recovered sufficiently to keep those businesses going, so that what we see is a maintenance of employment and maintenance of businesses in existence. We don't want to see significant numbers of insolvencies. We don't want to see significant increases in unemployment, as that will then dampen down the recovery. So the end of the year is going to be a crunch point in terms of seeing whether or not these businesses and households can sustain themselves, because the economy is starting to recover in a manner which allows them to be sustained. Another key issue that has not been talked about, but is beginning to be talked about in a wider economic community, is that if we did reach a crunch point at the end of the year and there was significant unemployment and there were significant business failures, then there's an added complexity of a potential financial crisis as people households start to default on their debt and businesses start to default on their loans. So when we see analysis of W's in terms of the shape of the recovery, what they're talking about there is this sort of end of the year crisis where we see increases in unemployment, we see increases in business failure, we see lack of consumer and business confidence causing the economy to go down again. So it's enormously important that we sustain our businesses, we sustain our households through the crisis, and then we start to see the economy recovering. And obviously, if we were to get a vaccine, that would be an enormous contributor to that. Also, we have to be aware that the global economy and activity in the global economy is heavily synchronized. From the UK's perspective, it's important that not only we recover, but those economies that we trade with significantly also need to recover. Now, 60% of UK trade is with the European Union and North America, so it's enormously important that those economies recover and drag everybody up with them, as it were. Malcolm talked about Brexit and the fact that we will Brexit on January the 1st, 2021. Central to the Bank of England's assumptions in the scenario that I put forward to you today is that there is frictionless trade between the UK and the European Union post January 1, 2021. And then we don't need a resurgence of protectionism. Obviously, the protectionist noises that are being made between the US and China at the moment are unfortunate. But what we do need is we need open and free trade and economies that are synchronized in their recovery, that are recovering together, which will allow us all to come out of this in much better shape. And also, there are issues there with the rich economies of the North, as we used to say. So the rich economies of Western Europe, North America, and China need to provide finance to the weaker economies to see them through the crisis. This is a chart that the Bank of England produced in the report, and it's on page 50. I would implore you to go and read it, because what it looks at is the sectoral impact of the crisis. Now, Malcolm alluded to this briefly in his speech, but on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see there, as we go up the screen, the sectors are being increasingly impacted by COVID-19 in terms of collapse of demand. On the right-hand side, we see the contribution that those sectors make to the UK economy in terms of total spending in the economy. Now, what we've basically got is 50% of our economy that is defined as staples, so house, water, fuel, food and drink, communications and health services. Basically, they have not been as impacted by the crisis. They're likely to recover. Some of those sectors have actually done well in the crisis. Then we start to move on to areas of consumption that can be delayed. That accounts for about 23%. So recreation and culture goods, purchase of vehicles, we've seen new car purchases go down, furniture and household equipment, clothing. These are all expenditures that we can delay, and obviously we need to see expenditures on those things increasing as we come out of the crisis, and therefore my comments earlier about consumer confidence being important. We've got work-related expenditures around operations of vehicles and travelling to and from work. And then we've seen the social aspects of expenditure that have been heavily hit both by the lockdown, and the danger is that if we come out with a lack of consumer confidence, we don't go back into restaurants. We don't spend money on cultural events and recreation, and obviously we don't travel as much as we have in the past. So we need to think about those sectors. We need to think about the extent to which we're recovering and how those sectors will be impacted. And the more we can start to get that confidence going, start to get those areas of consumption being activated in our economies, then the quicker and the more robustly we will recover. This is something that I got from the Boston Consulting Group, which is now actually saying, so what does it mean for my business in terms of the nature of demand? I know in a podcast that myself and Malcolm did a number of weeks ago, many procurement people are asking themselves a question, you know, what is going to be the nature of demand after the crisis? People talking about this new normal. What essentially they've attempted to do here is to work through, you know, what are the potential implications of people spending more time at home? What's working from home doing in terms of certain demands, eating at home, being entertained at home? What about digital coordination, and what does that mean for certain sectors of the economy? Some sectors of the economy are going to be impacted in the pale green, whereas the brighter green is where the opportunities are. And many organisations now are starting to think about the nature of demand and what that actually means for configuring our businesses. We know that many advanced economies are expected to go into recession. And again, that goes back to my point about a coordinated recovery. And we need to keep an eye on what's happening in those economies where demand for our products is likely to be relatively strong. But then again, going back to Malcolm's point, where we have supply chain relationships and we need those economies to be active in order for us to be able to produce what it is that we want to produce. And then, you know, this point about consumer confidence, 30 million people in the United States have filed for unemployment in the last 6 weeks. This is going to impact consumer confidence. I've read papers coming out of Harvard this week that actually say this is likely to prolong the recovery. So rather than it being 3 years before we get back to the activity of 2019, some Harvard economists are predicting that for North America, that could be closer to 4.5 or 5 years. So what we need to do is to keep a close eye on these values, see how quickly these numbers are turning around, have a feel for what's happening in those economies that we trade with most robustly in the greatest volume, so that we can start to plan, we can start to take a view on where we think economic recovery is going to occur. Yeah, a question that I keep getting asked is, you know, our governments have engaged in massive amounts of borrowing. I looked at the Bank of England this morning. In May, we did 650 billion pounds worth of quantitative easing. And I keep getting asked the question, you know, is there a limit to how much the government can borrow? Is there a limit to how much money they can print? Well, first of all, if we're credit-worthy economies, we can tend to borrow more than economies that are not as credit-worthy. And a couple of effects are happening there. International investors, when we get a crisis such as the one that we've got at the moment, will tend to engage in what we call a flee to quality. They will go to those countries that they feel are most likely to be credit worthy, and frankly, they're not looking at return on assets, they're looking at return of assets. So if I lend my money to the UK government, if I lend my money in the EU, if I lend my funds to North America, I'm more likely to get that money back. The second thing that we can do is actually print money. So the Bank of England can buy securities, can buy assets of businesses, they can buy assets of government, they can buy treasury bills and provide the funding by effectively printing money. There is a danger that that causes inflation. Historically, over the last 10 years, it's not tended to do it in terms of consumer price inflation, but it has caused equity price bubbles, it has caused property price bubbles. The third thing that you can do is borrow money on another country's credit rating, hence the cartoon. Essentially, and this is a big debate at the moment inside the European Union, Spain can borrow money on international markets by issuing euro bonds, where essentially they're using the credit rating of Germany to do so. So this is the point about, we need to provide liquidity to recovering economies. We need to provide liquidity to emerging or less robust economies. But if we're going to do that, we need to be clear about the fact that we are doing it by using the credit rating of the stronger economies in the world. And there is a debate, there's been a very robust debate in Europe in recent months about whether or not that should be the case. But the thing that we have to remember is that this is not a one-person game. This is not I win, you lose. In the end, nobody's going to win unless everybody wins. What does that mean? It essentially means that we need to recover from this crisis as a global economy. And by recovering from this crisis as a global economy, it is in our interest. It is in our interest in the United Kingdom to make sure that Europe recovers, to make sure that Latin America recovers. And it's quite interesting to view what the role of China will be in this. China has a vast amount of liquidity. It's an incredibly wealthy economy. That liquidity essentially being loaned around the world to affect the recovery of global economies is not only in the interest of the global economies, it's in the interest of China. So we need major economies, Germany, United Kingdom, US, China, to actually provide the liquidity that is going to allow the global economy to recover. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully what I've tried to provide you with is a whole series of variables that you need to be looking at so that you can start to take a view on how you think the economies that are most important to you and your business are likely to recover. There is a vast amount of data out there. Don't look at the headline data, try to look at the assumptions that underlie that data and try to look at how those variables which support the headline data are actually moving, and on that basis start to develop your own view of how you think economies are going to evolve out of this crisis. So thank you for your attention. Again, if there are any further questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And I'm now going to hand over to Scott Dance from Hays, who's going to take you through the detail of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, John. As always, as insightful as ever during these strange times for us all, I guess. So just as a way of a formal introduction, my name is Scott Dance, for those who don't know me. I've been at Hays for 18 years now. It's a fairly long time, I'm sure you'll imagine. I'm the head of our procurement supply chain division for the UK and Ireland. And I also work with a number of our customers around key recruitment solutions. I'm going to talk to you today for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so around some of the key insights and findings from this year's salary guide. Helen alluded to it earlier. We are the SIPS knowledge partner for recruitment and have been for a long time and have an extremely important and collaborative relationship with SIPS. This, again, is the 6th edition as a report. Again, what Helen mentioned earlier, there's 5,000 procurement professionals have completed this survey, which is actually 1,000 up on those last year. So thank you as always for our continued support. For those of you that didn't manage to fill out the report this year or the survey this year, or got sidetracked along the way, please can you do so next year? I guess what this report include? It includes a broad range of market topics, of which I'm going to cover some today. I'm going to start off with how procurement is viewed. So I guess prior to COVID, 70% of you said that procurement is very much valued within your organisation. But as we look down the table, there's still crucial work to be done in terms of influencing key and internal stakeholders and senior leaders if procurement is seen to become even more highly regarded and a greater contributor to business success, which I guess reigns true if we look at some internal challenges. With 50% of you have said that over the next 12 months, managing the risk and being seen as a strategic partner is going to be key to your business this year, which I guess is a challenge in itself, given all the other challenges that COVID has presented with ourselves. One would hope that given all the positivity around the media, of which some of Malcolm covered off earlier, hopefully some of those challenges and some of those barriers with internal stakeholders will now change and diminish, as a number of you, as I would call you, unsung heroes, have worked tirelessly to keep the front line operating. So what does the hiring outlook look like over the next 12 months? I guess it's quite hard to tell. And certainly it's been a lot of changes within the last 10 weeks, certainly for us and also the recruitment industry. And I can imagine a number of your industries too. Prior to COVID, 60% of you said actually you were looking to recruit over the next 12 months. Now I'm guessing that those figures would have changed, with 54% of you saying that you've struggled to recruit over the last 12 months across many different areas, including specific sector skills and industry-related experience. So I guess whilst there has been a huge downturn on recruitment, there have been a number of businesses that are recruiting. And actually, we've seen a turn for more people recruiting over the last couple of weeks. What those that have been recruiting have actually found it easier to recruit than they have previously. Because actually, if you think about it, they've had more access to talent pools than they ever have done. If you think about those that are furloughed, and even those that are working would normally be in their office, possibly sitting next to their boss or in an open plan office with other colleagues. So it's harder to access them during a normal day of work. We've seen a number of businesses shift from a traditional method of recruiting, so face-to-face interviews, etc., to actually working their way through different processes and changing and adapting very quickly to get people on board quicker than they have done previously, which I guess we'll have to look at what happens in the next 12 months or so. But actually a lot of businesses now are actually thinking, should we remove the first stage interview, for example, from a face-to-face, which is often hard to arrange and often time consuming, to more of a virtual interview. This will then hopefully speed up the recruitment process for everybody involved. So what skills are in demand? What we can't take away is the technical skills, because as Malcolm alluded to earlier, these are key in looking at the challenges that lie ahead. Some of the key technical skills this year have been around business analysis, negotiations, and contract management, which are going to be extremely key in getting a number of businesses through this crisis. Yet again, just to heighten the levels of the perception of procurement within your organization, you'll need to continually develop those relationships, and having a certain amount of training and technical knowledge will help build that trust and credibility within your organization. So from a soft skills point of view, I guess what are in demand at the moment? You can see there that communication, influencing and change management skills are highly in demand, and they will certainly reign throughout this COVID pandemic and as we move through to what the next phase may look like. I see change management being even in more demand in the future than it ever has been before. Some of the businesses that we're speaking to, whether or not you've been thriving or in somewhat of a crisis at the moment, there's definitely a lot of changes that are going to happen from an internal point of view, from a structural point of view, but also externally, and looking at the suppliers that have helped you through this crisis. So will you want to work with them in the future? And those that haven't, and looking at the whole supply chain in the future, which demands a lot of people with change management expertise. Dare I say the word Brexit as well? Again, there's a lot of changes that are going to happen in order to comply with certain legislation, but also drive businesses forward. How have salaries changed? Hopefully, I'm going to portray some good news here. If any of you follow the government's Office of National Statistics, they'll tell you that all industry sectors have had about a 3.4% increase than they have done over the past 12 months. However, the average procurement professional continually outshines this, with the average procurement professional seeking to earn an extra 4.9% than they did last year. Again, good news for the profession. And if you look at the average salaries, you will no doubt see that actually £48,000 per annum is far higher than other industry sectors. If we break that down a little bit further, the private sector, as you'd expect, have the average earning salaries, followed by charity and non-for-profit, and then the public sector. I guess it remains to be seen of what happens over the next 12 months or so to whether or not this is sustainable or whether or not they'll grow. Again, hopefully a number of you on this call have received a pay increase, with 73% of you professionals stating that you received a salary increase this year, which hopefully is good news for the profession, and businesses are starting to understand the value of procurement. Let's have a look at salaries on average by region. And yes, I can imagine that probably 80% of you are looking at London first of all. And whilst we've seen that London remains to be the highest salary bracket for each region of the UK, as probably expected, we haven't seen as much growth in the last year or two as we had done previously. The highest growth this year has seen Scotland, with a number of financial services businesses and other corporate functions really investing in that region in terms of procurement functions and hiring. So I guess it remains to be seen what happens over the next 12 months. And I guess out of all the slides that I've shared with you today so far, this would be one that I wish I could fast forward to and have a crystal ball to see what the outlook looks like for the next 12 months. Because social distancing, as we know, is set to continue for a long, long time. But actually prior to COVID, a number of people were looking at, do they want to commute those long journeys into large cities? With people looking more about their health and well-being and flexi working, etc. We've also seen a number of businesses actually changing their recruitment policies now and their hiring policies and their onboarding, etc., to actually have people working more remotely in the future and not just for here and now. So actually, will businesses be able to open up wider talent pools if they're recruiting from wider locations, if, for example, they're offering people to work from home 3 days a week? I guess it remains to be seen, but I guess it's a challenge for all organisations across the next 12 to 18 months. So what is important to employees apart from the salary? And I guess this is from a retention point of view, but also a hiring one. In terms of timing, I can't go through each individual block, but I will cover a few off. I think, again, as what Malcolm alluded to earlier, around staff training and development, we need to continue as a profession to keep enhancing and training and developing our procurement professionals, which will hopefully have a huge impact on businesses as we move forward. The challenge, though, often is what I see from a recruitment point of view, is these aren't often highlighted during the recruitment process. So if you do pay for SIPs and invest in your learning and development internally and have mentoring schemes, then please highlight them on your adverts and your job descriptions, as those were often written some time ago. Company reputation is becoming extremely important. It's actually the first time this reached the top 5 since we've written these salary guides. EVP is becoming a huge thing. And I'd ask you a question. When was the last time that you looked at your company's page on Glassdoor, for example? What are people saying about you from your employees, from people that you've interviewed, and for people that have left your business? This could have a damning effect on if you're trying to hire in the future. I also take that one step back. When was the last time you looked at your company page? How easy is it to access diversity and inclusion reports? And also the values of your organization, because these are going to be key in retaining and also hiring staff in the future. I then scroll down to flexible working policies, which I spoke about on the last slide. But actually many businesses now are really fast tracking their working policies, not just from a flexible point of view, but from a whole host of benefits as well. And we will start to see completely different work packages for current employees, but future employees as we move through the different phases and a bit beyond, which hopefully will be a benefit and a bit of a shining light throughout this pandemic. Gender pay gap continues to be an issue in a number of sectors, especially at the advanced professional level. The private sector, again, there's a huge disparity there between what males get paid and what females get paid, despite the gap narrowing by 9% this year. Work still needs to be done by organisations to be more transparent and actually to start really driving this agenda forward. The public sector, however, have made some really good progress and have narrowed the gap by 11% this year. And actually, if this continues through to next year, we'll pretty much be on a level playing field, which has to be good news for all. And maybe some learns out the private sector could take on board in narrowing this gap. The charity non-for-profit, whilst the gap isn't as wide as the private sector, still needs to be a lot of work, and we haven't really seen a lot of movement in the last 12 months. So just have a look at earning power from those that have MSIPs to those that don't. And I guess probably the 6 years that we've been collating this guide with SIPs, we've seen this happen a lot, that the average person is earning far greater than those with MSIPs. And again, we've talked about the profession and the perceptions of the profession. This has to be good, knowing that people that are trained and gone through their qualifications are getting paid more, and hopefully the value is reigning true throughout every organisation. An interesting figure here on the right-hand side of your screen is that 64% of employees request MSIPs or working towards MSIPs when recruiting. And we've seen a huge influx of this probably over the last 12 to 18 months now, and we'll probably see it set to continue. more so in the private sector, with more businesses across the private sector really trying to invest in the profession, which again must be great news. I've got a couple of slides to go through, but let's have a look at the interims. And for those of you that A, hire interims, or B, are an interim. Let's look at by gender. Again, a huge disparity between the male and females, but actually this gap has closed significantly over the last 12 months, with the average male day rate going up around 5%, but females are whopping 13%. So again, there's still work to be done, but it shows that the gap is closing. If we look by sector, IR35 will certainly be a challenge this year across the private sector, with people putting in policy changes and having a look at their contingent workforce estate with a view to looking at the go live date of IR35 in April this year. Due to the COVID pandemic, this has obviously changed and been deferred to next year. However, it's pretty split between private sector organisations. Some of the large corporates have invested so much time, money and effort in putting into policies for this April, they're continuing their trend so they're ready for next year. Others have deferred this, which means they've had access to greater talent that still want to operate through their PSC limited companies. From the public sector point of view, day rates have been fairly consistent, and so is the intake. What I will say, that although many companies are going through some economic change and obviously some distress, we may well see the investment of interims over the next few months as we look to seek back to working towards what the new norm will look like. As I say, I've covered off IR35 a little bit, but actually I could probably speak all day and I don't really have time to do so right now. So if you do have any questions around IR35, please visit our dedicated page and I'm sure that would help you. So just to finish off on a few key recommendations, as I've said earlier, and what Malcolm said earlier as well, we really need to see the profession being at the forefront of any organisation, from all the way from the planning stage and all the way through to more of a BAU type SRM type function. Use recent achievements. They don't have to be yours or your business, but some of the ones that have been highlighted recently in recent terms, and use that as leverage within your stakeholder community and to put that into context within your role and within your function and how it can operate to really help drive business efficiencies, as they're surely going to need that right now. Start having a look and evaluate your hiring plans. Has your hiring been on hold for the foreseeable future for the last couple of months? But actually, what does your estate look like now? What are the roles that you had on hold or have on hold at the moment? Do you need a different skill set to get you through the next 1 or 2 years? And if you have had recruitment on hold for all that time, maybe now it's trying to look at taking those plans off hold to really influence your organisation. And as I said earlier, let's not forget about technical skills at all, but have a bit more of a focus on the softer skills when recruiting, and actually take a look right here and right now is what is going to set you in best stead as we go through this crisis. Thank you all for listening. Hope my knowledge and insights have rang true with some of your organisations, and hopefully there's something to take away for the rest of you. If you want more information around regionalised activity, please feel free to go onto our website and look at our offices, locations, and you'll be able to have access to all of our contacts regionally. But apart from that, thank you again for listening. I'll now pass you over to Helen, who's going to finish off with some Q&A. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. So we're going to kick off first with some poll questions, just before we go on to your Q&As you've submitted. So the first question, can you please all select from one of the 3 answers? So number 1, how has the perception of procurement within your organisation changed during COVID-19? We just want to understand if you still feel valued by your organisation, or it's gone up or down. We suspect it might have gone up, but we just want to see if that's the case. Number 2, are you still likely to are you still recruiting in the next 12 months? So again, kind of linked to number 1, but we just want to see if your organisations make the money available so you can add value to your organisation over the next 12 months. And number 3, we want to see flexible working and attitudes is becoming the norm at this moment in time, and we expect that that is probably going to be a high yes as well. So if you could just submit your responses as quickly as possible, please. Great. So Scott, would you like to comment on these?
Yes, I guess why not? I suppose Malcolm might have more of an answer and some good news stories on number 1. But I guess if I cover off number 2 around the recruitment and where it might seem, I guess that there is a lot of uncertainty, as I've said earlier, around what's going to happen in the future. And I think that the businesses that have recruited and worked remotely, they've actually seen a real, I guess, loyalty from the new recruits, but also they've actually started to see a step change in their environment as well. And these new procurement people have already made an impact. So I guess it's worth thinking about what your estate looks like over the next couple of months. I guess if I then take on number 3 as well, around flexible working, we're looking at that internally for our own business actually. And pretty much every conversation I have with anybody, whether it be an employee or whether it be one of our customers, that it's going to change for the better, which, as I said earlier, is probably hopefully a silver lining out of this crisis and pandemic, where more people will have more time to spend with their loved ones and also doing other social activities when obviously we're permitted to do so. I don't know whether or not, Malcolm, that you want to cover off one.
Yeah, I can certainly comment on the first one. Yeah,
Yes.
look, I mean, it's good. It's good to see that a majority have indeed seen the image of procurement being changed positively. By the way, I'm also not surprised that the unchanged number is relatively high, and that's because we keep on going on about the fact that procurement should be doing more, procurement should be more seen in organisation. Hey, listen, there are some really good procurement teams out there, and in some organisations, procurement is absolutely already seen as being at the core of how an organisation operates. So, yeah, not surprised to see those results at all.
Great. Okay. So we'll just move on to some Q&As. We haven't got an awful lot of time left, but initially, I'm going to start with one for you, Malcolm. And this was one that came in from Chantel. I would be interested to hear from Malcolm Harrison what SIPs are doing or considering to help women progress to senior roles within procurement, e.g. mentoring, coaching networks.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Look, thanks, Chantal. I think look, this is a really important question, and although I'm, I guess, slightly pleased to see that, well, I'm very pleased to see that the gap has closed a little bit in terms of the pay differential. I'm not happy to see that there still is a pay differential, which is what Scott's slides show. But I think this lack of diversity, and I think it's more than just gender diversity too, but it's lack of diversity at senior levels is an issue. It's a problem for SIPs too, actually, because it means we struggle to get a real gender balance, the diversity balance in terms of our speakers or our judges. We want to have more people, more good people, more diverse people to be able to choose from. And yes, we absolutely want to find ways of facilitating how we can support women. And we've done some of this in the past. We've run focus groups in the past. I've been involved personally in some mentoring in the past. Look, there's no lack of willingness or commitment. And we'd love to have a conversation with anybody that can say, look, what are some concrete suggestions, some things that we could do more of and could do differently? I think we also know this is not just a procurement and supply issue. And, I've certainly talked to some other professions. Certainly the HR profession sees similar issues. So I think other professional bodies are grappling with the same issue, and we will talk to them too. I think there's a lot more that can be done. I really, really welcome concrete suggestions. And it's not only, it really isn't only a UK issue too. I mean, Scott, do you want to add anything more to this?
Hi, Malcolm. Yes, I guess from our point of view and what we look at, it's more of an organisational challenge as opposed to an individual challenge. And I think that organisations need to get better at actually analysing the whole of their teams and businesses. As you mentioned, it's not just a procurement supply chain thing. Technology is one of those as well. and actually probably sees an even wider gap from those senior professionals that are females to males. So, I think that, again, the more we try and influence and the perception of procurement grows within an organization, the more time will be spent in actually probably looking at closing that gender pay gap. But I think, you're right, Malcolm, we've all got a duty to play. And again, any other concrete suggestions that you think could help change that, more than happy to help with as well. And also any of those organizations that are struggling to grapple this within the procurement supply chain, again, I'm equally happy to have a conversation with you around how other organizations are tackling this challenge.
Okay, so Chantal, I hope that helps. But come and talk to us about it. And if you've got some concrete suggestions, I'd really like to sit down and talk to you about those.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott and Malcolm. So moving on, John, there's a couple of questions from Angus here, which I think you could answer both of. So I'm going to put them together because they're quite short. Should the government fund business loans and furloughing staff creating zombie firms? And basically, which sectors are going to suffer the most in the medium to long term?
Yeah, so with respect to the first question, normally what we would say is, if a business is failing and can't sustain itself, then it should normally be allowed to go bankrupt, and that's the natural process of businesses emerging and businesses failing. But what we're actually looking at now is a situation where if we were not to support these economies, there would be massive business failure. There would be households that are coming under enormous pressure. So what the government wants to do from a macroeconomic perspective to keep the level of both confidence and activity in the economy at very high levels is to support those businesses and households through this period of time so that we can get them to a point where the economy can then sustain them. If we were not to do that, then what would happen is the depth of any recession would just be much greater. And we will see that in some economies around the world. I was looking at some stuff from South Africa yesterday. They haven't got the capability to provide the support that we have, and therefore their economy will suffer much more greatly, will suffer to a greater extent than ours. With respect to what sectors are going to be most hit, I think you need to go back to that slide that I showed from the Bank of England. Probably the best slide that I've seen on this across the whole crisis. So essentially, on one hand, you're actually looking at, well, there's the sectors that are most impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, and then on the other hand, you're seeing, well, there's the impact on the economy. And essentially, if our economy doesn't recover, there is a danger that not only those that are most impacted by COVID in terms of being shut down, but that those sectors, because they're discretionary expenditures, because they're expenditures that we can postpone, because they are discretionary expenditures, we will see those sectors impacted most. So those in the top half of that diagram are the sectors that we really need to keep a close eye on. And I know there was a question about hospitality. We need business confidence to return. We need to, test, track, trace. We need to be able to deal with the crisis if we're going to see those sectors emerging. And also they need to innovate in terms of the goods and services that they provide to us.
Okay, thank you, John. So we are getting really over time now, but I think we've got time to direct one quick question to Scott. So I'm interested to understand why you think change management skills are less in demand than communication and influencing, when everything procurement does has change management at its core. And that's from Alison.
Yeah, very good question. I guess that these weren't my suggestions, by the way. These were what people filled out in the survey to start with. I guess communication and change management can be all seen as one and the same thing, because actually the way we communicate from, again, a change management point of view, an influencing point of view, or whatever it might be, is kind of a real key skill. So just having change management on its own, without having good sound communication, influencing skills, is not going to be enough. Because actually your ideas that you may have around how you change an organization may be great, but actually if you can't cascade that and tell that story to the people that are going to invest in those changes, it's going to be very hard to do so.
And Alison, I wouldn't perhaps read everything you always see in a survey. Look, change management, communication, influencing skills, all three of them, absolutely critical for procurement supply chain professionals, absolutely critical.
So as we're over time, I think we're going to have to wrap up now, but just to say that SIPS, Hays, will be in contact with you, and feel free to contact Scott. He left his details. So they will send you a copy of the report, and we'll be in touch with you, and please keep communicating with them with any further questions. So a really big thank you to all our panelists. Really want to thank Hays for being our knowledge partner, for doing such a good job with us on the report, the salary survey report, which we've done with them for the last 6 years. Also would like to thank Danielle Goodrick, who has worked really hard on the report with Hays and hasn't been on the webinar today. Also, Sophie, thank you for hosting the webinar. It's not been the easiest. So thank you to all. And just to also say that the salary survey will be up on our site on the 30th of June. That's our official launch date. It will be supported with interactive maps on global maps on salary and lots more assets on soft skills and all sorts of things. So please make sure you go on 30th of June and look at what we've got when we launch the report and the global reports too. So thank you all for attending, and really hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.